I want you to know something about revenge. It tastes sweeter when it's served with a smile and a standing ovation. I'm Tracy Wint, 79 years old, and I'm sitting here in my beautiful home in Willow Creek, Tennessee, looking at a photograph that still makes my hands shake after all these years. It's a picture of me at 18, standing outside my childhood home with a single suitcase, tears streaming down my face, while my parents watched from the front door like I was some kind of stranger they couldn't wait to get rid of. That day, my father Harold looked me straight in the eye and delivered words that still echo in my mind. You'll suffer in this life, Tracy, and it'll be exactly what you deserve. My mother Margaret stood right beside him, nodding like she was agreeing to Sunday dinner plans instead of disowning her own daughter. They threw me out like yesterday's garbage, convinced they were teaching me some kind of lesson about respect and family values. What they actually did was light a fire under me that burned so bright, it eventually lit up the whole town. You see, they thought they were ending my story that day, writing the final chapter of a girl who dared to dream beyond what they thought she deserved. But what they really did was give me the greatest gift of my life. They set me free to become everything they said I'd never be. And when I finally got my chance to show them just how wrong they were, well, let's just say the whole town was watching, and my parents couldn't hide their shock if they'd tried. This is the story of how I turned their cruelest words into my greatest triumph, and how sometimes the people who hurt you the most end up giving you exactly what you need to soar. They expected me to crawl back within a week, begging for forgiveness and ready to accept whatever scraps of love they were willing to throw my way. Instead, I walked straight into the Willow Creek Public Library that very same afternoon, my eyes still red from crying, and met a woman who would become more of a mother to me than the one who'd just thrown me out. Lillian Harper was her name, and she took one look at this broken 18-year-old girl clutching a sketchbook full of dress designs and said something that changed the entire course of my life. She didn't offer me pity or tell me everything would work out fine. She handed me a stack of fashion magazines and said, "Child, you've got talent bursting out of you, and now you've got something even more valuable. You've got nothing left to lose." That library became my sanctuary, Lillian became my champion, and those fashion magazines became my roadmap to a future my parents couldn't even imagine. What started as the worst day of my life turned into the beginning of something extraordinary. I built an empire right here in the town where they said I'd amount to nothing, and when the moment came for them to see what I'd become, well, the look on their faces was worth every tear I'd shed and every sleepless night I'd endured. This is how a discarded daughter became the pride of Willow Creek, and how the very people who tried to bury my dreams ended up watching them bloom in ways that made the whole town take notice. If you can, please leave in the comments where you're watching this old lady from. It warms my heart to know that my voice is reaching far, maybe even places I never had the chance to visit. And if you like my story, please leave a like and subscribe to Grandparents Archives to help us achieve our first 1,000 subscribers. It helps us to keep sharing meaningful stories like this, and makes our voices heard. You know, when people ask me about my childhood in Willow Creek, I always tell them it was like living in a house made of glass, beautiful from the outside, but one wrong move and everything would shatter. My parents, Margaret and Harold Wint, weren't cruel people, but they were people who believed there was only one right way to live, and that way had been decided long before I was even born. Harold spent 12 hours a day at the lumber mill, his hands rough and his back aching, and he came home expecting order. Margaret kept our house so clean you could eat off the floors, and she made sure Samuel and I were always dressed like we were heading to a job interview, even just to walk to the corner store. Samuel, my older brother, had this gift for reading people, especially our parents. He knew exactly when to speak up and when to stay quiet, when to ask for something, and when to just wait for it to be offered. I used to watch him navigate conversations with them like he was walking through a minefield, stepping carefully around topics that might set them off. And it worked for him. He was their golden child, the one who would carry on the family name with pride and dignity. Me, I was different from day one. While other little girls were playing with dolls and having tea parties, I was taking apart old clothes to see how they were put together, then trying to put them back together in new ways. I'd sit at the kitchen table after homework was done, drawing pictures of dresses I'd seen in the one fashion magazine Mrs. Henderson at the general store would let me flip through. My parents would walk by and see these drawings, and I could feel their disappointment like a weight pressing down on my shoulders. They'd exchange these looks over my head, the kind of looks that said, "What are we going to do with this child?" Without ever saying the words out loud, they made it clear that my dreams were inconvenient, impractical, and frankly embarrassing to a family that prided itself on being sensible and down-to-earth. The breaking point came 3 days after my 18th birthday, when my parents sat me down at our kitchen table and told me they'd been talking to the Weatherbys about their son Robert. Robert Weatherby was 24, worked in his father's hardware store, and had apparently expressed interest in settling down with a nice girl from a good family. My parents had already worked out the details. We'd have a proper courtship period, get engaged by Christmas, and be married the following spring. They talked about my future like they were discussing the weather forecast, completely matter of fact, as if my opinion was just a minor detail they'd forgotten to consider. I remember sitting there listening to them plan out my entire life, and something inside me just snapped. I'd spent 18 years trying to be the daughter they wanted, biting my tongue when they dismissed my dreams, smiling politely when they steered conversations away from anything I was passionate about. But hearing them hand me over to Robert Weatherby like I was a piece of property they were trading felt like they were asking me to bury myself alive. So I did something I'd never done before. I said no. I told them I wasn't going to marry Robert Weatherby or anyone else they picked out for me. I told them I wanted to study fashion design, maybe even leave Willow Creek, and see what else was out there in the world. The silence that followed was deafening. My father's face went through about 5 different shades of red before he finally exploded. He slammed his hand down on that kitchen table, so hard the salt and pepper shakers jumped, and he started yelling about ungrateful children and family reputation, and how I was spitting in the face of everything they'd sacrificed to raise me properly. My mother just sat there staring at me like I'd grown a second head, shaking her head slowly back and forth. Then my father delivered the words that would change everything. He called me a disgrace to the family name and told me that if I was so determined to ruin my life, I could do it somewhere else. He said I'd suffer for my selfishness, and that when I came crawling back, they might not be willing to take me in. I went upstairs and packed everything I owned into one suitcase, my clothes, my sketchbooks, and the $43 I'd saved from doing odd jobs around town. When I came back downstairs, my parents were still sitting at that kitchen table, looking like they were attending a funeral. Samuel was standing in the doorway, and I kept waiting for him to say something, anything, to show that he understood why I had to do this. But he just stood there watching me walk toward the front door, and he never said a word. That hurt almost as much as everything else, losing the one person in that house who I thought might have understood me. Walking out of that house, I felt like I was stepping off the edge of the world. I had nowhere to go, no plan, and for about 10 minutes I just stood there on Main Street wondering if I should turn around and beg them to take me back. The smart thing would have been to apologize, agree to marry Robert Weatherby, and accept the life they'd mapped out for me. But there was this voice in my head, maybe it was stubbornness or maybe it was something stronger, that kept saying, "Tracy, you're going to prove them wrong about everything." I had no idea how I was going to do that with $43 and a suitcase full of dreams, but I knew I had to try. My feet carried me to the one place in Willow Creek where I'd always felt comfortable, the public library. It was a small brick building with tall windows and wooden shelves that creaked when you pulled books out, and it smelled like old paper and possibility. I pushed through the front door, probably looking like a lost puppy, and there was Lillian Harper behind the circulation desk. She was maybe 40 years old, with gray streaks in her brown hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She looked up from whatever she was organizing and saw this 18-year-old girl with red eyes and a suitcase, and instead of asking questions or offering sympathy, she just said, "Rough day." I must have looked like I was about to fall apart, because she came around from behind that desk and guided me to one of the reading tables in the back corner. She didn't push me to talk, just sat there quietly while I tried to figure out how to explain that my entire life had just blown up in my face. When I finally managed to tell her what had happened, she listened without making those pitying sounds people make when they hear about your troubles. Then she stood up, walked over to a shelf I'd never paid much attention to before, and pulled out this thick book about fashion design and the history of couture. She set it down in front of me and said something I'll never forget. "Child, I've watched you come in here for years, always gravitating toward anything that had pictures of beautiful clothes in it. You've got something special, and now circumstances have given you the freedom to do something with it." She opened that book to a page showing designs by someone named Coco Chanel, and she said, "This woman started with nothing and changed how the whole world thinks about fashion. Maybe it's time you stopped asking permission to chase your dreams and started making them happen." I had no idea that this quiet librarian was about to become the person who would help me turn my parents' worst fears into my greatest victory. Those first few months after leaving home were the hardest of my life, and I'm including childbirth and losing my husband in that statement. I found a room at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house on Elm Street. And when I say room, I mean a space barely big enough for a single bed and a dresser, with wallpaper that was peeling at the corners and a radiator that clanged all night long. Mrs. Patterson charged me $12 a week, which meant I needed to find work fast. I got hired at Miller's Diner as a waitress, working the breakfast and lunch shifts for $1.25 an hour plus tips. And in the afternoons I cleaned houses for whoever would hire me at 50 cents an hour. Every evening, I'd count out the money I'd made that day, set aside what I needed for rent and food, and whatever was left over went into a coffee can I kept under my bed. I was saving for fabric and eventually a sewing machine of my own. Some weeks there was nothing left over. I remember eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner more nights than I cared to count, telling myself it was temporary, that I was building toward something bigger. The library became my refuge and my classroom. Lillian would unlock the doors at 9 in the morning, and I'd often be waiting outside, ready to spend every free hour I had studying fashion magazines and design books. She started keeping a pot of coffee in the back office, and would bring me a cup without me even asking. Sometimes she'd sit with me and point out details in photographs, how a designer had constructed a sleeve, or why a particular neckline was flattering. She had this way of making me feel like what I was doing mattered, like I wasn't just some foolish girl chasing an impossible dream. About 6 months after I'd left home, something happened that changed everything. The annual Miss Willow Creek pageant was coming up, and one of the contestants, Betty Jean Morrison, came into the diner where I worked looking absolutely frantic. Apparently, the dress she'd ordered from a shop in Nashville had arrived, and it was completely wrong. The wrong size, the wrong color, everything. The pageant was in 2 weeks, and she had nothing to wear. I don't know what possessed me to speak up, but I told her I could make her a dress. She looked at me like I'd offered to fly her to the moon, but she was desperate enough to say yes. I spent every free moment over the next 10 days creating that dress. I'd found this beautiful blue fabric at the remnant shop, and I designed something that played up Betty Jean's best features while still being appropriate for a small-town pageant. The night of the competition, I sat in the back of the high school auditorium and watched her walk across that stage, and I swear the whole room went quiet. She didn't win the pageant, but she didn't need to. After the show, people kept coming up to her asking who had made her dress. By the next week, I had 3 more women asking if I could make something for them. Word was starting to spread around town that Tracy Wint could create something special with a needle and thread. As word about my dressmaking started getting around town, my parents' reaction was exactly what you'd expect. They couldn't stand that I was succeeding at something they'd told me was foolish. Instead of being proud that their daughter was making a name for herself, they started a campaign to undermine me at every turn. My mother would corner women at the grocery store and tell them I was living an immoral lifestyle, that any decent family shouldn't associate with someone who'd abandoned her own parents. My father would shake his head whenever my name came up and make comments about how I was bound to fail eventually, that people who turned their backs on family always got what was coming to them. The worst part was watching my brother Samuel navigate all of this. He'd finished law school and come back to Willow Creek to start his practice, and he was everything my parents had ever wanted in a child: successful, respectable, and completely willing to pretend I didn't exist. I'd see him around town, and he'd look right through me like I was invisible. One time I passed him on the sidewalk outside the post office, and I said hello just to see what would happen. He nodded politely like he might to any stranger, and kept walking. That hurt more than anything my parents had said or done. But then something wonderful happened that my parents definitely hadn't planned for. I met James Wint, everyone called him Jimmy, at a church social that Lillian had convinced me to attend. He was a carpenter who'd moved to Willow Creek from Memphis to take over his uncle's construction business. And he had these gentle hands and kind eyes that made you feel like he was really listening when you talked. We started seeing each other, and for the first time since I'd left home, I felt like I had someone in my corner who understood what I was trying to build. Jimmy would come by the boarding house after work and sit with me while I sewed, asking questions about what I was making and why I'd chosen certain fabrics or designs. He never made me feel like my dreams were too big or impractical. When I told him I wanted to open my own shop someday, he didn't laugh or tell me to be realistic. He started talking about what kind of space would work best and how we could make it happen. In 1968, he proposed to me with a ring he'd carved himself from a piece of cherry wood, and we got married in a small ceremony at the library with Lillian as our witness. By 1970, I'd saved enough money to start thinking seriously about opening a real boutique, instead of just taking orders from my boarding house room. I'd found a perfect little space on Main Street, and Jimmy had drawn up plans for how we could renovate it. All I needed was a loan from the bank to get started. I walked into First National Bank of Willow Creek, wearing my best dress, and carrying a folder full of business plans and customer testimonials, feeling more confident than I had in years. The meeting started well enough. Mr. Henderson, the bank president, seemed impressed with my work and my plans. But then he excused himself for a few minutes, and when he came back, his whole demeanor had changed. He told me the bank couldn't approve my loan, that my business plan wasn't solid enough, that the risk was too high. Later, I found out through the grapevine that my father had visited the bank the day before my appointment. He'd told Mr. Henderson that I was irresponsible and unreliable, that I'd abandoned my family and would probably abandon my business commitments too. Standing outside that bank, holding my rejected loan application, I heard my father's words echoing in my head. "You'll never amount to anything, Tracy." For the first time since I'd left home, I wondered if maybe he was right. After that loan rejection, I spent about 2 weeks feeling sorry for myself, which was longer than I could afford, but exactly what I needed. Jimmy would come home from work to find me sitting at the kitchen table, staring at fabric samples, like they held the answers to all of life's problems. Lillian finally had enough of watching me mope around the library and told me she had someone I needed to meet. She'd been corresponding with Nora Benson, a girl who'd been 2 years ahead of me in high school and had moved to Nashville after graduation. Apparently, Nora had started her own business importing home goods and had done quite well for herself. Lillian arranged for Nora to visit Willow Creek, and when she walked into the library that Saturday afternoon, I barely recognized her. The quiet girl I remembered from high school had transformed into this confident woman in a tailored suit who talked about profit margins and market expansion like she'd been born understanding business. But when I showed her some of the dresses I'd made, her whole demeanor changed. She held up a blue cocktail dress I'd finished the week before and examined every seam, every detail, like she was studying a piece of art. She asked me how much I'd charge for a dress like that, and when I told her, she laughed and said I was undervaluing my work by at least half. Then she made me an offer that nearly knocked me over. She wanted to invest in my business, not as a loan I'd have to pay back, but as a partner who believed in what I was building. She said she'd been looking for someone who could create custom pieces for her wealthy clients in Nashville, and my work was exactly what she'd been hoping to find. Within 6 months, we had the shop on Main Street up and running, and orders were coming in faster than I could fill them. Nora's connections in Nashville led to connections in Memphis, and soon I was making dresses for women whose names appeared in the society pages of newspapers across Tennessee. The wife of the mayor of Nashville ordered 3 dresses for different charity events. A pageant contestant who went on to win Miss Tennessee credited her success partly to the gown I'd designed for her. In 1974, I got a call that still gives me goosebumps. The daughter of a Tennessee senator wanted me to make her wedding dress. By 1975, Tracy's designs had become something I'd never dared to imagine. We had 4 women working in the shop, orders booked out 3 months in advance, and magazine editors calling to ask about featuring my work. The annual Willow Creek Founders Day Festival that year decided to include a fashion show as part of their celebration, and they asked me to organize it. I saw this as the perfect opportunity to showcase not just my designs, but the work of other local artisans as well. The day of the fashion show, the whole town turned out. They'd set up a runway in the park, with folding chairs arranged in rows like a real fashion event. I was backstage helping models get ready when someone told me my parents had arrived and were sitting in the 3rd row, arms crossed, looking like they'd come to watch a train wreck. My first instinct was to panic, but then I looked around at everything we'd built. The beautiful clothes, the excited models, the crowd of people who had come to celebrate local talent, and I realized I wasn't that scared 18-year-old girl anymore. The show was magical. Each model who walked down that runway was wearing something I'd poured my heart into, and the crowd's reaction was everything I could have hoped for. But the moment I'll never forget was when the final model appeared, wearing a stunning evening gown made from fabric Nora had brought me from Paris, and the entire crowd rose to their feet in applause. I looked out at that standing ovation and saw my mother's face, and for the first time in 13 years, she looked genuinely surprised. My father was clapping too, though he was trying to hide it. After the show, people crowded around me with congratulations and questions about commissioning pieces. Reporters from newspapers in nearby towns wanted interviews. Local business owners were talking about how my success was bringing attention to Willow Creek. In the middle of all of this celebration, I caught sight of my parents making their way through the crowd toward me. But instead of feeling nervous or angry, I felt something I hadn't expected: peace. I realized that somewhere along the way, I'd stopped needing their approval. Lillian, Nora, and Jimmy had become my real family, the people who'd believed in me when believing seemed impossible. Whatever my parents had to say now, it couldn't touch what I'd built. Looking back now from my rocking chair at 79, it's hard to believe how far this journey has taken me. Tracy's designs grew beyond anything I could have imagined that day I walked out of my parents' house with nothing but sketches and determination. Over the years, I've had the privilege of creating dresses for thousands of women, from nervous teenagers going to their first prom to confident brides walking down the aisle to accomplished businesswomen attending important galas. Each dress told a story, and I got to be part of writing those stories with fabric and thread. But the thing I'm most proud of isn't the fancy clients or the magazine features, or even the financial success. It's what happened right here in Willow Creek. As my business grew, I started noticing young people in town who had that same restless energy I'd felt as a teenager, kids who were creative and ambitious, but didn't see any opportunities for themselves in our small town. So in 1978, I started offering sewing classes in the back room of my shop. Just a few kids at first, teaching them basic skills on Saturday afternoons. Those Saturday classes turned into after-school programs, which turned into summer workshops, which eventually became a full-fledged vocational training program. Over the past 40 years, I've taught over 300 young people to sew, and many of them have gone on to careers in fashion, interior design, theater costuming, and textile arts. Some stayed in Willow Creek and opened their own businesses, while others moved to cities like New York and Los Angeles to chase bigger dreams. But they all learned the same lesson I'd learned, that your hands and your imagination can take you anywhere you want to go. In 1995, Jimmy and I decided Willow Creek needed a proper community center, a place where young people could learn trades and older folks could share their knowledge. We bought the old Woolworth building downtown and spent 2 years renovating it into a space with workshops for woodworking, sewing, cooking, art, and music. Jimmy designed and built most of the interior himself, creating these beautiful workbenches and storage areas that are still being used today. He was so proud of that building. He'd walk through it every morning before it opened, checking to make sure everything was perfect for the day's activities. My daughter Sarah took over the day-to-day operations of Tracy's Designs in 2000, and she's done incredible things with it. She kept the custom work that made us famous, but also expanded into ready-to-wear pieces and online sales. The shop now employs 12 people and ships dresses all over the country. Sarah has her grandmother Margaret's business sense, but her father's gentle heart, and watching her build on what we started has been one of the greatest joys of my later years. Jimmy lived to see all of this happen, which means everything to me. He was there when we celebrated the shop's 25th anniversary, when Sarah graduated from fashion school, when the community center won a state award for excellence in vocational education. Right up until he passed in 2005, he would introduce me to people as my wife Tracy, who can make magic with a sewing machine. He never doubted for a second that I could accomplish whatever I set my mind to, and when I was feeling overwhelmed or uncertain, he'd remind me of how far we'd already come together. Losing Jimmy was the hardest thing I've ever been through, harder even than being disowned by my parents. But even in my grief, I could hear his voice telling me to keep going, to keep building, to keep believing in possibilities. He'd always said that the best way to honor the people who love you is to live fully, and that's what I've tried to do every day since he's been gone. Lillian Harper passed away in 2010 at the age of 87, and I spoke at her funeral to a packed church. I told everyone there that Lillian had saved my life by seeing potential in a broken 18-year-old girl and giving her the tools to rebuild herself. When the community center needed a new name that year, there was never any question about what to call it. The Lillian Harper Community Center now serves over 500 people a year, offering everything from literacy programs to job training to senior citizen activities. There's a plaque by the front entrance with her picture and a quote I chose. She believed in people before they believed in themselves. Standing in that community center today, watching teenagers learn to use industrial sewing machines and senior citizens teaching traditional crafts to elementary school kids, I think about how this all started with a librarian who handed a fashion book to a girl who had nowhere else to turn. Lillian taught me that family isn't just the people you're born to, it's the people who see your worth when you can't see it yourself, who stand beside you when the world seems to be against you, who celebrate your victories like they're their own. Jimmy, Lillian, Nora, Sarah, and all the young people I've taught over the years, they became my real family, the family I chose and who chose me back. The reconciliation with my family didn't happen the way you see in movies, with dramatic conversations and tearful hugs. It was quieter than that, more gradual, and honestly more complicated than I'd expected it to be. My parents never did come around to admitting they'd been wrong about me. Even after Tracy's Designs became successful, even after the community center opened, even after local newspapers wrote articles about my contributions to the town, they maintained this careful distance. They'd nod politely when they saw me at the grocery store, and my mother would sometimes comment to other people that she was pleased I'd found my way. But they never acknowledged the pain they'd caused or expressed any real pride in what I'd accomplished. For years, that bothered me more than I wanted to admit. I'd built this incredible life, helped hundreds of people, brought jobs and recognition to our little town, and the two people whose approval I'd once craved most still treated me like a polite acquaintance. I spent a lot of time being angry about that, feeling like they owed me something, an apology, an acknowledgement, some sign that they understood how wrong they'd been. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In 1987, about 10 years after that fashion show, my brother Samuel walked into Tracy's Designs on a Tuesday afternoon when I was working alone in the shop. I hadn't spoken to him in over 20 years, and seeing him standing there in his lawyer's suit, looking nervous and older than I remembered, took my breath away. He stood there for a long moment, looking around at the dresses and the sewing machines and the photos on the walls of all the events where my designs had been featured. Finally, he said, "Tracy, I need to tell you something I should have said a long time ago. I was wrong to turn my back on you, and I'm sorry." His voice cracked when he said it, and I could see tears in his eyes. He told me he'd been thinking about our childhood, about how creative and determined I'd always been, and how he'd known even then that what our parents were asking me to do would kill something essential in me. But he'd been too afraid of disappointing them to stand up for me, and he'd spent decades regretting that choice. We talked for over 2 hours that afternoon, catching up on all the years we'd lost. He told me about his law practice, his wife, his children, nieces, and nephews I'd never met. I showed him around the shop, explained how the business worked, told him about the community programs we'd started. When he was getting ready to leave, he said something that meant more to me than any praise from strangers ever could. "I'm proud of you, Tracy. I'm proud to be your brother." We started having lunch together once a month after that, and his family became part of my life in a way I'd never expected. Samuel's apology helped me understand something important about forgiveness. I realized I'd been waiting for my parents to validate my choices, to admit they'd been wrong, to somehow make up for all those years of rejection. But holding on to that expectation was keeping me trapped in the past, still that 18-year-old girl desperate for their approval. I had to make a conscious decision to forgive them, not because they deserved it or had earned it, but because carrying that resentment was weighing me down. My father passed away in 1992, and my mother in 1998, and they never did apologize or express pride in what I'd accomplished. But by then, I'd found peace with that. At both of their funerals, I spoke about the good memories I had of them, about the values they'd instilled in me about hard work and persistence, even if they'd been wrong about how I should apply those values. Samuel and I stood together at their grave sites, and I felt grateful that we'd found our way back to each other, even if it had taken decades. Looking back now, I can see that my parents did give me something valuable, even if it wasn't what they intended. They taught me that I was stronger than I knew, that I could survive rejection and disappointment and still build something meaningful. Their belief that I would suffer became the fuel that drove me to prove them wrong. In a strange way, their lack of faith in me forced me to develop an unshakable faith in myself. These days, when my grandchildren come to visit, they love hearing stories about the old days, about how Grandma Tracy built her business from nothing and how Great Uncle Samuel and I found our way back to being family. But the lesson I always try to leave them with is this: no one else gets to write the story of your life. Other people will have opinions about what you should do, who you should be, what dreams are worth chasing, and which ones are foolish. Some of those people will be strangers, and some of them might even be family. But at the end of the day, you're the one who has to live with the choices you make. I tell them to dream as big as they can imagine, and then dream a little bigger. I tell them to find their own version of Lillian Harper. Those people who see your potential even when you can't see it yourself, who believe in you when believing seems impossible. And I tell them that if someone tries to convince you that you're destined to fail or suffer, you have the power to prove them wrong, not out of spite or revenge, but because you deserve to live a life that fills you with joy and purpose. That's the real victory, not changing other people's minds about you, but building something so beautiful and meaningful that their opinions become irrelevant. You know, telling you this story has reminded me why I've always believed that our experiences, especially the difficult ones, are meant to be shared. Every person who walks through the doors of the Lillian Harper Community Center, every young person who learns to sew in my old workshop, every woman who puts on a dress I made and feels beautiful. They're all part of a chain of hope that started with one librarian who saw something in a broken-hearted girl. I'm sharing my story here on Grandparents Archives because I know there are people out there right now who are facing their own version of what I went through. Maybe you're 18 and your family thinks your dreams are foolish. Maybe you're 40 and starting over after everything fell apart. Maybe you're 70 and wondering if it's too late to try something new. I want you to know that it's never too late, and you're never too old, and your dreams are never too small or too big to be worth pursuing. If something in my story spoke to you, I hope you'll subscribe to Grandparents' Archives because there are so many more stories like mine that need to be told. Stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary things, who overcame impossible odds, who found strength they didn't know they had. Hit that like button if this reminds you that you're stronger than you think you are, and please share this with someone who might need to hear it today. But here's what I really want to know. Tell me in the comments about your Lillian Harper. Who was the person who believed in you when you couldn't believe in yourself? Who handed you the book or gave you the advice or opened the door that changed everything for you? Sometimes we get so focused on the people who doubted us that we forget to celebrate the ones who lifted us up. Let's fill these comments with stories of the good people in our lives, because those are the stories that give other people hope. Keep these stories alive, keep believing in each other. And remember, you get to write your own ending.